Good morning. Good morning. It's right where morning meets afternoon, which is already a concept in physics. Is there such a thing as actually this, when the midnight, is there actual midnight or noon? Does it belong to morning? Does it belong to afternoon? So we'll talk about indeterminism shortly. Okay. Another physics element is the ability of how much we can eat. Even though our stomachs, I always thought about this, that the hand is, you can only put that much food in your hand. But for some reason, when it goes here, it seems to expand. So how do you explain that exactly? So a lot of interesting things happening this Pesach that are connected to physics and to Kabbalah, to mysticism, to mysteries of existence. Right? Okay. And in general, the Jews themselves, of course, are walking paradoxes. We are, which is, of course, another central theme in modern physics, the concept of a paradox. We're the paradox of all nations. We've been here for so many thousands of years, more persecuted than anybody, and yet we're still standing. Whereas the great Roman Empire, or even the Egyptian Empire, I should say, and the Roman Empire and all the others are gone. So there you have, so all of you are walking miracles, walking paradoxes, walking anomalies amidst the seemingly logical universe in which we live. So I'm going to take a few concepts in physics which are relatively new, like the last 100 years, and demonstrate their parallels, and you can even say their origins, though not all the physicists know that, in Kabbalistic, mystical, and ultimately Torah teachings, because it all originates from the Bible. So it's the question of how you interpret it. So I can talk about many, but I'm going to choose the three I'm going to choose are, number one is, I just talked about indeterminism, which we'll discuss in a moment. The second one I'm going to discuss is the area of light, the nature of light, the properties of light. And the third, since it's recently been in the news, I thought it's appropriate, is the black hole. Recently Wall Street Journal, not just Wall Street, NASA released images, the first images of a black hole. And it's been a very mystifying entity predicted by Einstein, but now actually photographed. Now, to be honest, I don't know these photographs. They always say that these photographs are a combination of many photographs, and they've been touched up. So I'm not even sure whether it's actually an image or not. But what we could say, there is a black hole, the concept of black holes. Are those three satisfying to you, or would you like to submit any others? Those to me seem to be three powerful. As you probably know, and this is not a physics class, and I'm no means a physics expert, but I've done enough reading and enough research and enough confirmation with people who call themselves experts, if there is such a thing even. But to me, the most fascinating part of it all is not just the parallels, but also the applications to life. See, where science ends is science can give you the theory and can give you the analysis, and we can even tap into these new understandings of the universe and turn it into technologies, which you're all holding in your hand right now, and we just heard a reminder of, is all based on modern physics. But applications as far as personal application, like how it can make your life a healthier life, better relationships, better ways of dealing with challenges, and so on, there science has nothing to say. It's actually morally neutral officially. And when you add the Kabbalistic and the Hasidic dimension, what's, as I said, fascinating is there are also actual practical and psychological, emotional applications, which really is a school of thought that's not really become popular, the bridging between psychology and philosophy and science and physics. But I find that to be most intriguing because, to me, at the end of the day, it only makes a difference if it's relevant to your personal life. So it's good for intellectuals and academics to theorize, but I think even more fascinating is when you apply it to life. So I'm going to add that dimension into it all, of course. So where do we begin? Maybe we begin with the theory of relativity, which of course is another one. But more in a humorous way, they say, of course, Einstein is the theory of relativity, 1906, 1907, his special theory of relativity and his general theory of relativity. And the Jews always made the joke that Einstein, definitely as a Jew, figured it out, because Jews always lived with relativity. The famous comedians and linguists, Jigen and Schuchmacher, if you ever heard of them, Yiddish comedians, they were also linguists, they knew language well. So they have the famous Jewish theory of relativity that goes like this, that 3 hairs on your head isn't much, and I can tell you that. But 3 hairs in the soup is a whole different story. So suddenly you see how the same 3 hairs in one area is meaningless, in another area it's very disturbing. The other one that they say is this, that there were the 5 Jews. Each one taught a primary school of thought. And for Moses, everything was the law. For Jesus, everything was love. For Marx, everything was money. And Freud, everything was sex. And Einstein, everything is relative. That's the two. I know you didn't come to hear stand-up comedy on physics, but I just thought it's always good to warm it up before we get into more intense intellectual discourse. Okay, so with that said, I'll begin with the black hole, actually. I think it's the best way to begin, for no particular reason, but because it's in the news, and also it may lead and make it easier to understand the other two. So what exactly is a black hole? So Einstein, in his observations and his theories, he theorized. He did not have proof. He theorized that there would be a concept of a black hole based on the following calculations. Once he established that light is so vital to all that exists, and we'll talk about light a little later, so then the question, of course, is, we all know that the power of gravity, which actually is Newtonian physics, so it's a factor, the power of gravity, how that affects light. So, I'm sure you've heard the concept of bending light. Light bends. We all see it every day. The fact that there are colors, a prism. Light in its natural state is white. So why do we have blue, red, and all the different colors of the spectrum? Because light is bent. When you put it, let's say, in a crystal, you suddenly see like rainbow colors. What's a rainbow? A rainbow is the bending of light, especially when there's moisture in the air, because moisture, water, if you shine a light through water, it also will have colorful effects. You see it in chandeliers. We see it all the time. So actually, colors that you see right now in this room is different forms of white light. So it's bent light. What causes it to bend? What causes it to be shaped? So it can be many things, but one factor is gravity. So Einstein predicted that if there's enough gravity, gravity will affect the properties of light, which affects everything else, because everything is affected by light, because we only see things through light. You hear light years away. What's a light year? Is the speed of light, since it's so distant, the only way we can measure it is how fast does light travel? A few 100,000 miles an hour? A second. So instead of saying a star is, let's say, trillion miles away, you say it's 300 light years away, or 3,000 light years, or 3 million light years away. So light is what allows us to see things. If you close the lights in this room, nothing would change the objects, but you wouldn't be able to see it. So once you turn on the light bounces off objects. That bounce off and sends a message to your eye, and you take a snapshot of it, essentially. Actually, cameras are a technological replica of the eye. So the eye has those powerful abilities. Now, what changes one color to the next? How do you know that we are looking at this as a blue sweater? Maybe, how do you know it's blue? How do you know what I see is what you see? Maybe you see red and we just call it blue. So this has been actually experiments done. How do you determine that? But the fact of the matter is, it's determined objectively because it's about how much light is absorbed and how much light bounces off, etc., etc. So based on all these calculations, he speculated. No proof, because he did not have the instruments to measure that if the gravitational pull would be strong enough in a particular star, then it's hypothetically possible that the star would not emit light, because the gravity would be so powerful that you would not be able to see it. So in other words, let's say when we look at the moon, we see the moon. There's gravity in the moon, but it's not strong enough to not control the emission of light. That's why we can see it. But imagine that the gravitational pull of the moon was so powerful, more powerful than the power of the speed of light, then we would not see the moon. That would be called a black hole. It's black because it's there, but you can't see it. So this was a prediction that he made that some actually debunked, as they debunked other theories. But then, I don't know what year it was, I didn't look it up now. I think it was maybe 30 years later, that the first experiments with different telescopes, they identified something they considered to be a black hole. So of course the question is how? If you can't see it, you can't see it. No telescope is going to see it if the light can't get out. So can you guess how? How they figured it out? Well, they figured it out through what's called extrapolation. For example, if I put a piece of metal right here on the table, and it's just stationary, just standing there, and then suddenly I'm a magician and I say I'm going to move this metal, and the metal starts moving. Now, most of you are not that gullible to say that I have the power to make a move. You'll say, what's the trick? So some will say, maybe there's a magnet under the table that I'm some way controlling, so when the magnet starts moving, the metal starts moving. Now, you look under the table, you don't see a magnet. So then you say, maybe there's strong enough magnets behind the walls. Again, when I said move, either someone activated it or I activated it. You're not going to just buy into that it's moving, I assume, right? So what do we know from that? That you know something is causing it to move, but you don't know what. That's called extrapolation. Instead of identifying the direct, if I pushed it with my hand, everybody sees that. But here, basically, there's a force that is causing something to move. So how did they discover the black hole? They saw asteroids and even stars or other things in orbit that were very clearly on a certain course, and then suddenly they come to a certain area and they change course. So if you see a planet that's been going for thousands of years, has been orbiting in a certain particular orbit, and then suddenly it's off course, you say something happened. What caused it to go off course? There's no captain on the ship, so to speak, that turned it. So you have to say there's something there that's pushing it. And that's how they discovered it, that there must be something in that space. Anything that comes close to it will be affected by it. And I'll just give you a psychological example, since we talked about applying it. How do we know, for instance, how does a trained person know what's causing certain reactions we have? Maybe some of us have rage inside of us. We get angry. And some people, in the same type of situation, will not get angry. So what does a good psychologist do? I'm talking about a good one. There are many not good ones. But a good one, how do you figure it out? Do they have a particular prophetic way of looking into our unconscious, into our past? How would they know if your mother was a very angry person that you picked that up from? So you do it by questioning, by asking questions. That's what a black hole really is, in a sense. What you're looking at is you can't see you only see the symptom, you don't see the cause. How do you get to the cause? You do what any good evaluator is going to do. Like a doctor will say to you, you have pain in your finger, God forbid, start touching, and by process of elimination say, okay, it's not a nerve, it's not a muscle, it must be a spasm or something else, maybe it's a slip disc or whatever it is. The same thing here, a good questioner will ask questions. I'll give you an example from my own counseling. I ask somebody, so tell me, what kind of relationship did you have with your mother? I don't want to talk about my mother. Everything was fine with my mother. Let's move on. Okay, so what do you think? Right away, there must be an issue with the mother. It's just like someone says, those two Jews that go to the foot doctor, and they both have sciatica and pain. So one of them goes into the doctor, the other one's sitting in the waiting room, and he hears yelling and screaming because I guess the doctor's touching his leg to figure out what's happening. And, he's like really terrified to be next. Anyway, finally his friend comes out, he's limping and so on. He says, wow, that was horrible. So the friend goes in, brace yourself, this is not going to be easy. The friend goes in, and this one's waiting to hear, his yelling and screaming. It would make him feel a little better at least. And no yelling and no screaming. And he can't believe it. The guy comes out, he says, how do you have such self-control? He says, I showed the doctor my other leg. He didn't show him the leg that hurts. So of course there was no scream. Like the guy that says to the dentist, It's your job to figure out which tooth hurts. I'm not going to tell you, you know. My point is that we never look where the problem is, but you look. So the only way a doctor can figure it out is by feeling around until you get to understand it. So you start asking a person about their mother or their father, and the more they avoid it, the more you know there must be something there. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And it's no one's job to God forbid, to impose and assault someone's psyche and say, we must talk about your mother or your father or whatever, but you get a sense that there's something there. So you never can see the person's inner psyche, the unconscious, but you can see its effects. Unfortunately, many people are affected by the effect. We respond to symptoms. We don't respond to the root. There's always a root. And that's a perfect example of the black hole. So Einstein speculated based on mathematical equations and theories. And then it became evident again and again and again. Too many times it was observed that objects somewhere in outer space are being affected by something that no one can see. As a result, Einstein's theory was confirmed and it became part of scientific lore as a given. There are black holes. There are black holes. And now, as I said a few weeks ago, an image. Now, if you look at the image, you see there's a black hole in the middle and there's light around it. So I'm not suggesting the image is a fake image. It definitely is capturing something that was there. But as I said, you can't see blackness. So you have to see the black in contrast to the light. So that's a black hole in physics. I'm not going to go into more details. There's more dynamic. There's more theories, updated theories. Matter of fact, last year I spoke about this, and someone in the room was a physicist, which I always make sure not to speak in front of physicists, because then, I speak before you, you could think I know something. I'm kidding. Obviously, I'm not coming without any information. But he did point out to me some new research, which I was not aware of. He's not here today. I guess he doesn't trust me anymore. I'm just kidding. He's here, one of the guests. He did point out a new theory regarding this, but it really didn't change the dynamics that we're discussing. So I'm not going to go, as I said, into every detail here. Where's the parallel now with Kabbalistic thought? So there was actually uncanny. It's not called black hole, perhaps, in those exact words. Actually, in one place it is called that. The Arizal, the famous Kabbalist called Isaac Luria, who lived in the 15th century in Tzfat. If you've ever been there, there's a mikvah of his. He's buried there. There's shuls of the Arizal. He only actually lived till the age of 38 and a half. So we only have exposure to him, his students, to only a year and 8 months. But in that year and 8 months, this man literally, you can say, revolutionized Kabbalistic thinking. Now, revolution means not that he innovated new things, he revealed new things, but he also systemized it in a way that really we can talk about it today. Up till him, Kabbalah existed, obviously. There's a whole line of teachers, Kabbalistic teachers, from the beginning of Moses himself. However, it was much more cryptic and much more concealed. He began to really turn it into a doctrine. And his great student was Reb Chaim Vital, sometimes his acronym Rachav, who documented that Arizal did not write most of his teachings. It was his student Reb Chaim Vital that wrote it down. The Arizal impacted Jewish life in ways that are beyond words. Almost everything that you know about Jewish life today, the Arizal had impact. Not just the Kabbalistic ideas, even customs and laws and so on. For example, most of the Friday night service is till when we say the Chadaidi, until the second half, is all Arizal's. He composed it, or his students composed many of those prayers. So the Arizal has a doctrine that's called in Hebrew Soid HaTzimtzum. Have you ever heard of this word, Tzimtzum? Okay. It's called Soid HaTzimtzum. It literally means the secret of the Tzimtzum. This is a plan. This is just to show you how we're affected by physics. And do you have a black hole in your phone? Okay. So say that Tzimtzum is the concept, the secret of the Tzimtzum. Now the word Tzimtzum is a Hebrew word. Let's translate it. Tzimtzum is an exact translation. I don't have one word for it. I use 2 or 3 words. It can mean concealment. contraction, even withdrawal. These are different words used to translate it. But let me explain what he said, and then we'll get back to the word itself. What I want to most identify is where he got it from, and how it literally is like the precursor of black holes. If someone had learned that in Kabbalah and knew some astronomy, if I always amazed if Einstein would have known that concept, how that would affect his thinking. I don't think he knew it. I have no proof that he didn't know it, but it doesn't seem like he was exposed to that. But it's possible that he did, because it wasn't a complete secret in his time. There were masters of it. And you probably know this, that a lot of science has a lot of sources in biblical and mystical teachings. So, the concept is basically based on doctrine, you can say. The doctrine of the Tzimtzum is based on trying to establish or reconcile fundamental theological problems. And I'll just mention a few of them. Number one is, if God is one, the unity of God, we say every day, Shema, Hashem Echad. How did a multiple universe, how do we have a universe that's so multiplicitous? Meaning, so many multitude of creations. How does one turn into many? Doesn't seem possible. One should create one, at best. A second issue, which is maybe a bigger question, is how is it possible that if God is omnipresent and omnipotent, how is it possible that we don't feel God's existence? How is it possible that we have free will? That we could sit here in our chairs and 7.5 billion people on this planet and do whatever we feel. We can completely defy God's laws. We can completely defy even basic laws between man and man. To put it in different terms, the Talmud says that human beings are like one large organism. We're one large organism. Is it possible that the right hand would hit the left hand? Is it possible that one organ or limb would affect another? That's a disease, God forbid, if the body turns on itself. So based on that concept, how is it possible that human beings can perpetrate injustice to each other? Can you hurt part of yourself? So clearly we don't feel that we're part of one. We feel we're separate. So the big question is, how is that possible? If the godliness is a unity that is inherent and beneath the surface of all of existence, so how is it possible that we can be so separate that we can actually harm each other, kill each other, go to war with each other? And there are many more such questions. I'm not going to go through all the theological and philosophical questions, but the Arizal came and taught the following: that God, in his mysterious way, that's why he calls it Sod, it's a secret, but God basically concealed his presence. Meaning, prior to the Tzimtzum, we're talking about conceptual time, not physical time. The only reality, the only consciousness was a divine consciousness. But there would be no room for anything to exist. These are actual quotes from Eitz Chaim, which is a classic work of the Arizal, which says there'd be no room for anything else. A beautiful analogy given for this is from Rav Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Chassidus. Think of a teacher, a brilliant teacher, who's spouting all his wisdom, or all her wisdom, and without any filters, what would happen? No student would be able to relate to it, because the consciousness and the brilliance and the genius of the teacher would be completely dominating. Think of it, even we find this in life. People who are so dominant, they don't leave room for anybody else. We'll talk more of the application a little later, but the guy that goes on a date, this is like a negative version of a tzimtzum. And he talks about himself for 2 hours. And then finally, in his benevolence, he turns to the girl, he says to her, okay, enough about me. Now, what do you think about me? So it's like a second level of narcissism. So there's no room for somebody else. I'm sure you've met people in this world that don't leave room for anyone but themselves. So that's a negative example of what I just said. But think of a teacher so brilliant that when he speaks, everybody's overwhelmed. So the Arizal says the divine itself concealed his presence, basically almost inverted his presence, and allowed space, conceptual space, for another consciousness, which would emerge, which would ultimately become us, existence as we know it. Some of the mystics put it this way, that pre-Tzimtzum consciousness is the divine is omnipresent, and existence is yet to emerge. It's a novelty. And that post-Tzimtzum consciousness is existence is the predominant consciousness and reality, and the divine is now a novelty. Which explains, of course, you know how to shut this out? I'll show you. There's a button on the left. There's a button on the side. Really? Okay. So basically, this explains the question, the first question I asked, or the second question actually. How is it possible that we exist in the presence of a divine and can be so divisive and even hurt each other? Because there was an inversion that took place. Think of it this way. Another way to explain it. Everyone knows, if I asked you, why does a person cry? So you'll say, well, they probably feel sad inside. You don't say, first you cry, then you feel sad, right? First there's a sadness, or joy for that matter, and that evolves into, for some reason, it wells up into tears, your tear ducts, and then tears come out of your eyes. The same thing with a smile. A physical contortion of the face, that's called a smile, is a physical manifestation of a feeling that you cannot see. So you wouldn't know if I'm happy or sad unless I showed it to you in my body language. But imagine someone decides, you know what? You know what makes you cry? What makes you sad when you cry? You say that's ridiculous. That's looking at existence from the outside in, when we're supposed to look at it from the inside out. So essentially, using the Tzimtzum back to the Tzimtzum, without the Tzimtzum, we would never have an outside in look altogether. Because everything would be driven by this unifying divine consciousness. The fact that it was concealed, so now we have a reality where we look at and we go the other way around. Oh, I see a chair. What is the chair made up of? Wood. What's wood made up of? Wood is made of molecules, and molecules are made up of atoms, and atoms of subatomic particles, and subatomic particles of sub-subatomic particles. And how far the rabbit hole you want to go, we never know. We don't know how far it will go. But we only go from the outside in. If someone said to you, is that you think how it began? Of course not. First were the subatomic particles, then there was the atoms, and then the molecules, and then the elements, and then the objects. So the Tzimtzum basically turned everything inside out. Think of it turning a glove inside out, where you think the glove is more important than the hand. So when we talk about the invisible hand, the invisible force, that's right now invisible, because all we see is the surface level. So if you think of it that way, then the Tzimtzum is the ultimate black hole. Not a physical one, a conceptual one. Because what is it? It really is energy. Because it's a divine energy to conceal. But it's an energy that conceals, that doesn't reveal. We don't really understand that, because for us, energy means light. Light would be energy. If someone says that when I show off the lights, you'll say, well, the energy isn't being used. That's incorrect. It's just inverted energy. In other words, it's energy withholding energy instead of expressive energy. So put it this way, in very practical terms. This great teacher I mentioned, let's go back to the analogy. What does he have to do to really teach well and effectively? He has to actually silence himself. He has to contract and conceal and withdraw into his own mind most of his ideas and spoon feed it to the student. If a brilliant teacher was going to teach ABC to a 5-year-old, with all his brilliance, without filters, what would you have? So you need to have a tremendous concealment. So let me ask you, for a great teacher, what is it more difficult to do? To teach or to conceal? Of course to conceal. For someone who's smart, it's much harder to be quiet than for someone who's not smart, because he has what to say. But he has to use the art of restraint to be able to allow the student space. So the real brilliance of a great teacher is not just a teacher who has great ideas. It's a teacher who understands and measures the students' so-called containers and figure out how to tailor it, the flow, that the students should be able to appreciate it. That is the real art. As a person who's, my whole life I've been into communication, and I teach people to speak, and I'm a writer. Writing and teaching and speaking is far more about what you don't say than what you do say. Because you could say a lot of things, but then you could also confuse your audience. The key is like with white space and black space on a page. People don't think about it, but ask any designer. What's more important, the letters on the page or the white space around the letters? So of course all of us would say the letters. Without letters there's no ideas. But that's incorrect. If you had just letters on a page, there was no white space, you couldn't read it. There's actually more white space on the page than black space. So letters, for them to really be able to be appreciated, have to have a surrounding white space for contrast. So bottom line is this, that the Tzimtzum is the ultimate and original black hole, because what it is energy, but energy to conceal, not energy to reveal. And the interesting thing is that the power to conceal takes more energy than to reveal. It's always that way. For a person who's very strong, it takes more effort for them not to use all their strength than to use all their strength. The power of restraint. So that is one tremendous parallel that I believe that if it was explored further and you brought together into one room some master Kabbalists and some master physicists, I have no doubt that you can come up with new ideas and theories in both worlds that would actually understand science better and understand Kabbalah better, because they literally are the same idea. One is obviously much more conceptual and much more, I would say, cosmic. The other one is more of a physical reality somewhere in outer space, but their parallels are undeniable. I heard, you've all heard of Rothko, right? The artist Rothko. He committed suicide in 1969. He was a Jewish artist, and he was a mystery. He was Russian Jew, Rothko. What was his first name? Saul. And his art goes today, this I'm sure will impress you, for millions and millions of dollars. You see it in the museums. They're usually very large murals. And his best art is the latest art that he created, is abstract art. For some of us looks like nonsense. And that is, they're basically black, they're boxes of different colors. So it's a signature style. So you'd see a big mural could be the whole wall, and it would be, let's say, orange, red, yellow boxes. And Chagall's another one, but this is Rothko. Now Rothko grew in success and grew and grew and grew. And he committed suicide at the height of his success. It wasn't because he failed. It wasn't because he was losing money. He was making the most money ever in his life. And it remains a mystery why. This artist, you can check it out. I decided to do some research. I don't know, I had some instinct. Now Rothko when he began, like many artists, began with regular art. They painted people and horizons and scenes and so on. But as he grew and evolved, he began to what they call deconstruct art. Essentially deconstruct what you see with your eye, start looking at the building blocks. So what are the building blocks of everything? And as they do that, you abstract, you take away the so-called externals, and you try to see like an X-ray of what makes things really look like. If you were able to strip away our skin and our bones, and we get to the DNA, or as I mentioned, the subatomic particles. So that's what Rothko was doing. Then I found somewhere, which is exactly what I was looking for, that he was delving into Kabbalistic writings. And Kabbalah was helping him do that, because Kabbalah does exactly that, as I mentioned. It doesn't look at the tears, it looks at the sadness. It doesn't look at the sadness, it looks at the cause of the sadness. Always deconstructing and trying to look at things not at the symptom level, but at the root level. So that's what he was studying. He was reading Kabbalah. And then I found that he was reading the Arizal, the concept of the Tzimtzum. And all analysts of Rothko point out that when he began deconstructing his early art, like in the late 50s and early 60s, was very bright colors. Like I said, yellowish blue, yellowish orange, red, and so on. As he went on moving through the 60s, they became darker and darker. Brown, blue, purple, to the point of gray and black. And reading the documents that I read, I'm convinced that as he was getting closer to the Tzimtzum, he was seeing that the core of existence was really a lot of darkness, not light. Science today, one of the big breakthroughs in the last decade, is dark matter. You've heard of dark matter, like the black hole? There's dark matter. They say that 90% of all solar systems is dark matter, not light. Light is a small fraction. I know it's an amazing statistic, but dark matter. he was in Kabbalah. When you start digging deeper, you come to places where you start saying, you come to the Tzimtzum, you realize everything began with darkness. And it was right around then when he created some of his darkest art, no pun intended, is when he did the darkest act. He committed suicide. So my theory is, it's a complete theory, that he came to a point, because he was a true artist, his passion was deconstructing, and he came to the end of his line. He hit the Tzimtzum, and the Tzimtzum can be a very, very foreboding place. It's like coming into a black hole where there's no light. And it could very well have affected him in his life, maybe feeling he can't go further, he had nowhere to go, or just evoking depressing feelings, but that's when he committed suicide. So I'm not here to talk about his suicide, I just wanted to point out. Now, I wish I would have met Mr. Rothko, because I would have taught him something, not mine. That if you look in the Arizal and you read a little further, it doesn't seem to have read what's going on behind the Tzimtzum. There's more light than ever. The problem is, when you get there, it's dark. But remember, there's a light that preceded the Tzimtzum, what's called in Kabbalistic and Hasidic teachings, Oir Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum. The light preceding the Tzimtzum. And had he seen that, I believe he would have had the hope. But he didn't go that far. Again, this is a theory, and it may be wrong, but my point I don't think is wrong. And that is that you can look at the world, and I want to bring this to a practical application. You ask some people, what kind of world do we live in? Some people say it's a very dark world. Yeah, there's glimpses of light. Here and there we see some hope. But overall, it's a dark world. It's a world of hostility, of corruption, dog eats dog, survival of the fittest. If people do not have any sense of fear of police or law enforcement, they'd kill each other. I mean, and you see, there's evidence. Look what just happened in, where is it, Sri Lanka? Yeah. Other events happening. You see a lot of hatred, irrational hatred. So you can make a case for a dark world. Some people, if you ask them, they'll say, no, it's a very bright world and has moments of darkness. I'm not sure what your feelings are on this matter. I personally have, from my observations, I think the difference between people, how they respond to this, is based on their own life experience. People who grew up in homes, unfortunately, that were dark homes, meaning warlike zone, a war zone between mother and father, between siblings, between family members, yeah, their impression of life is very dark. And it's a lifetime struggle for them to see light. And I think people who grew up in homes that were bright and beautiful, nurturing, loving homes, will probably lean toward a perspective on life that's more optimistic. Again, I'm not going to say this is 100%. We all, I know people growing up in beautiful homes and have a dark perspective, and people who grew up in very difficult lives and have learned to have a very bright perspective. So I'm not suggesting this is an absolute formula. But overall, I would say that's usually the case unless you work on yourself. Now, my personal perspective, I did grow up in a bright home, I have to say. So I'm subjective. I can't say I'm the rule. But I definitely will tell you my general attitude, and I've seen a lot of darkness too. I see it all the time. I see people talk to me, things in my mind I would never imagine what human beings can do to each other, what parents can do to children. I mean, the things that when I heard it the first time, I remember in my early 20s, I couldn't even believe it was real. So there's a lot of darkness in this world. Let's not deny that. The question, however, what lies at the heart of it? If you were to drill all the way to the core, what do you meet? A tzimtzum or light? So I would suggest, based on the black hole concept, and based on the tzimtzum concept, yes, it's black, and it's tzimtzum, it's dark, and it's concealment, but that's only its outer layer. Behind it lies tremendous energy, and there's an intention, there's a concealment. The concealment is not an end in itself. It's in order to achieve a greater revelation. And some of the Hasidic masters use an analogy for this. A parent wants to bring out the ingenuity of his or her child. So the parent hides. Like hide and go seek. Hides. And hides so well. And as the child, find me. The child begins to look. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. The parent hid themselves so well, at some point the child stops looking. And what happens? The child goes off living its own life and giving up. The parent, of course, is the greatest painful thing for a parent to feel, that type of rejection. But you hid yourself so well, the child gave up. And they explained that's the Tzimtzum in its worst fashion. The concealment was only in order for us to emerge as an independent consciousness so we can choose to live good lives. It wasn't meant for us to buy into it. And the way God is pained by his own darkness because he concealed himself so well. I just recently read when Christopher Hitchens, one of our resident radical atheists, died a few years ago. He wrote the book God is Not Great. An atheist, Jewish, his mother's Jewish. Only Jews can be such atheists, And he was asked, what happens if you come up to heaven and you discover there is a God? His answer I found to be very moving. He said, I will ask him, God, why did you conceal yourself so well? That's what he said. What do you think about that? Why did you conceal yourself so well? Yes, God concealed himself very well, to the point that we live in an agnostic universe, and it's easy to deny God exists. It's easy to deny ethical laws, that we're supposed to care about each other, and it's easy to buy into the selfish perspective that it's all about me, me, me. So the black hole and the parallel and Kabbalistic idea of the Tzimtzum all originate from the concept that yes, there's a need for darkness and concealment for existence to be, but that's not the ultimate goal. The goal is that it should bring out ingenuity and intelligence and creativity on our part to rise against it. And that's what Jewish people have always done. We're right now celebrating Passover. What do you think Passover is? It was the darkest time for the Jewish people. For 210 years, not for 10 years or 15 years. They were being perpetrated upon them a genocide. All of them enslaved in Egypt. And what does the verse say in the Torah? As they were oppressed, as they were oppressed, they thrived and they blossomed. Because they did not buy into the darkness. They were suffered. But they knew there's a deeper purpose. And as Viktor Frankl writes in his logotherapy, Man's Search for Meaning, he said the people who have meaning in their life don't suffer less, but they have an extra resource, hope. Knowing that there's some purpose and somewhere we're going to be redeemed. So that's the ultimate response to black holes and to a Tzimtzum and to any concealment in our personal lives, that it's not an end in itself, that there's something bigger and you have to see it through. So that's a subject, item number one. Let's go to item number two because of time, and I definitely don't want to be the one that deprives you of being first for lunch. So we go to item number two. I have to say that the food here is somewhat of a challenge. Would you say? Huh?
The energy to think.
I think it's God testing us to see whether we'll exercise some restraint. With Bruce Backman as his agent. This is Bruce's father-in-law. That's why I'm mentioning it. Yeah. He, behind the scenes, he's part of the conspiracy against us. Item number two we spoke about I was going to talk about indeterminism. Okay. So what is indeterminism exactly? To put it in simple terms, Newtonian physics, which was the dominant physics until Einstein came around, and definitely till quantum mechanics, was essentially deterministic. Nature is deterministic. They use the example of a billiard ball effect. You strike a billiard ball a certain angle, with a certain speed, with a certain motion, it will always react the same way. If there's a different reaction, it means there was a different action. So if I throw up an object right now in the air, every time, if I throw it exactly the same strength, with the same velocity and the same height, it will always fall down the same way. These are the deterministic laws of nature. We know exactly when was sunrise this morning. You can predict sunrise for the next 1,000 years because it's all deterministic. It's based on certain laws. If you don't know the laws, you may not know the outcome. But that's more of a lack of our own information and data. So it's all about determinism. Okay. Comes Einstein, and more importantly, quantum mechanics. That says, no, it's not correct. There are areas in existence in the subatomic world, in microscopic world, where things are not deterministic. Things are what they call probable, states of probability. Now, if you've never heard this before, it's going to sound completely weird and actually counterintuitive. Because what I just said, determinism, of course, everywhere around us is determinism. Everything we do is based on determinism. You do something, there's action and reaction, cause and effect. But then the quantum physicists came to discover weird results when they started looking into the subatomic world. Now, no one can see the subatomic world, so how do they see it? The same way like a black hole. You measure it through its effects. By high speeds, if you put atoms, you speed them up to tremendous speeds, or you heat them up to tremendous heat, it has certain impact. What we call nuclear fission or nuclear fusion creates an impact, and that impact tells you that these subatomic particles have properties. And they began to see things that what they call bizarre. Even Einstein, who never accepted it till the last day of his life, even including his last day, he called it spooky action from a distance. Spooky. Those are words used by scientists. It's spooky. It's weird. Einstein told Niels Bohr, another Jew, a Danish physicist, he said to him, God doesn't play dice with the universe. Everything is deterministic. And Niels Bohr purportedly replied, don't tell God what to do. Which I'll get back to in a moment. Interesting, they're both talking about God. One says, God doesn't play dice with the universe. Everything has laws, the laws of nature. And the other says, don't tell God what to do. So indeterminism is essentially that there are states of being called states of probability, some call it. There are different theories about it. There's Niels Bohr's theory and there's other theories, some call to explain it. But basically, something is still in a nebulous state, and it's not been defined or determined, is it this or is it that? And from this emerged a theory by Werner Heisenberg, what's called the uncertainty principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. What does uncertainty mean? That there's no way, not due to lack of knowledge, but fundamentally that you could know the position and velocity of a subatomic particle, or an atom for that matter, until you measure it. When you measure it, then you can know it.
It changes. When you measure it, it changes.
It takes shape. Before that, it can go both directions. I'll just give an example or two for it. Today, they've demonstrated, and this, of course, the men may not like this, but this is the way it is, that upon conception of a new child, it is initially female, and it's only later that a mutation causes it to become a male. Now, this actually parallels something that says in the Talmud that you can actually pray, even after conception, that the child should be male or female. How could that be? If it's a male, it's conceived as a male or conceived as a female. Because the truth is, it's still indeterministic at that state. And if anything, the feminine is the natural status quo, and as the masculine, that is the mutation. You can use it against your husbands if you like, if you wish, okay? You looked at him, I see. So the point being is that there are states what's called probability, which, as I said, is counterintuitive, but once you start understanding it, it's actually quite fascinating and beautiful. Because it means that before things take shape, they don't not take shape. I don't know culinary arts that well. I know how to consume, but I don't know how to produce. But I see sometimes my wife making a challah, or other things that are being made in the kitchen. As a man, I have no clue how that becomes this, And I see sometimes things, I say, what is this going to be? From my point of view, it's a state of indeterminism. Because it can become a challah, or it can become, for all I know, a chont. Is that true? Yeah. So there are ingredients that they're still in a state where they're not yet taken shape, and you could really turn it one way or the other. I'm just using some maybe silly examples. But anyway, bottom line is this. It's not my theory. It's a theory that's been established in quantum mechanics, indeterminism. And the weird thing is that nobody can figure out how from indeterminism does it become deterministic. And when it's in the deterministic world, it's absolutely deterministic. You cannot say, for example, based on the laws of indeterminism of the microscopic state, that we can say maybe tomorrow morning the sun won't rise exactly the same time. It doesn't affect it. So it's two worlds. One remains indeterministic and one is absolutely deterministic. And this is one of the big mysteries of science today. They're trying to figure it out. String theory has much to do with this, that tries to connect the two. This is one of the big problems in science, but I don't want to go into the things that have not been figured out yet. So how does this parallel in Jewish thought? So let's use an example. There was a French scientist, philosopher. His name was Laplace, Laplace. In the late 19th century, he stated the following scientific statement, which created a big uproar in the religious world, in the church, among the Christians. He stated the following, that based on scientific progress, you give me all the data on anything or anyone, and I can tell you what will happen with that thing or person till the end of time. The only thing why we can't predict it is because we don't have all the data. But if you can put all the data into a computer, I can predict how a person will behave, every choice they will make till the end of their life. And you can imagine, this upended the whole concept of free will. Meaning, everything is deterministic. You've been wired a certain way, and it's just a matter of you playing out a script that was written for you. The only reason we don't know what you're going to do, and you may not even know, because we don't have all the data. That was his statement, and you can imagine they wanted to crucify him. But it was already a different world then, the end of the 19th century. The church didn't have that power that they had in the time of Galileo. So, that was his theory. Then, a few decades later, comes the concept of indeterminism, and essentially undermined his whole theory. Because his theory was based on just lack of information, but not fundamental indeterminism. Once there's indeterminism, the concept of free will comes back completely. Because the fact is that it's not determined, and you really can make a choice. Laplace wasn't around, I think, after when those discoveries came out. I don't know how he would have responded. But today, his theory is no longer considered a fact. It's not correct. You can put all the data of information about anything, and you still will not know everything. You can know a lot, and you can predict a lot, but everything, no.
Not quite, no.
Right. No, you cannot say, how are you going to behave tomorrow? Are you going to be a nice person, or are you going to be selfish? That cannot be determined. Even if you have selfish genes, and even if you have nice genes, because there is an area somewhere in our souls, if you wish, that is indeterministic. So there you have another fascinating parallel that actually has real implications. It's not just a theory. The world, as predictable as it is, and as much as we rely on it, there are forces beneath the scenes that are not predictable. Now, this doesn't mean there's chaos. It doesn't mean it goes, no matter what, everything goes. But it just means there's a mystery. And I always wonder that maybe God planted that way, that don't think you're so smart and you can figure everything out. There are areas that remain fundamentally indeterministic. And as such, we have to be humble and say, as much as we know, there are areas that are fundamentally unknown. That's really the theory of indeterminism. So that's number 2. And we'll talk about the third thing, light. Where are we time-wise? Let me see. Okay, we're doing fine. Light. Now this one I find perhaps more fascinating than all of them, because until Einstein, light was not really a headline in physics and science. There was already discussion of photons, and other things in the end of the 19th century. But you go back early 19th century and before that, light was, there was sunlight, there was candlelight, and it wasn't really studied well, and it wasn't analyzed to the point where Einstein literally made light everything. Light equals energy. With that, he developed the most famous theory of all, E equals mc squared. That energy equals matter times the speed of light and the energy that it emits. And that identifies that matter and energy are interchangeable, which is a major revolutionary statement. In other words, matter and energy are not two different entities. They're just a matter of one can convert to the other, and you can never destroy. You can take a piece of wood and burn it, it'll turn into energy, fire. And even the fire goes out, the energy of the fire is somewhere in space. So you can't really destroy anything. It's matter and energy are reversible. And energy, at the essence of it, is light. Light is energy. Now, this concept, as I said, is relatively 110 years old, maybe. Anyone opens up any Kabbalistic work, the first thing is an analogy is constantly used are light. As a matter of fact, in Chabad Hasidic literature, whole entire essays and discourses analyzing why is light the analogy. There's so many analogies you can use for divine expression. You can use the analogy of speech. You can use the analogy of pouring water. There's many ways to describe transmission. Why light? And the reasons given for light are, again, fascinating parallels to Einstein's concepts on light. The two main reasons is, number one, light is a paradoxical entity. When you think of light for a moment, let's talk about sunlight. And we all see it all the time, sunlight. So there's a sun, a ball of light, a ball of fire, made up of gases. You could say it's a nuclear fireplace, full of unbelievable amount of energy and heat. We experience the sunlight. The sun is millions of miles away from us, but it emits light that travels to Earth, and we experience it either in the way of actual light. The sun rises, so the dawn breaks, and we have daylight. That's all a result of the sun. And the second way we experience it directly is heat, the warmth of the sun. There are, of course, other impacts of the sun on us, whether it's ultraviolet, ultra-red, and so on. Some are invisible, some are less invisible. The sun also has impact on our vegetation, things to grow, and so on. But let's distinguish between what is the difference between sunlight and the sun. So, what is light? The sun is, you can identify, it's a source of light. But what about light itself? On one hand, light has no substance of its own. Take away the sun, is there any sunlight? No. That's not the case with everything else. If I gave you a cup of water, I took a pitcher of water and I gave you water, you have the water forever. You don't need me and the pitcher. Sunlight doesn't work that way. Take away the sun, the source, and the light disappears. On the other hand, the sun is not here on earth. It is light of the sun. That's clear. It's not the sun itself. So the way they explain it, the mystics, is that light is the perfect analogy for divine expression. It's not God, but it's an expression of God. It cannot exist without God, but it's still an expression of God that's, so to speak, outside of God. Outside of God meaning outside of God's essence. So the sun would become an analogy for the divine, and sunlight is an analogy what's called for divine light. When I mentioned earlier about the Tzimtzum, concealment, what's he concealing? God can't conceal himself because God is not subject to revelation or darkness. He conceals his divine light. So you can think of light as being divine consciousness. So there's light and there is a source of light. And light has that dual property that though it is expressing the source, but it has no existence but the source. Why is that so vital? Because that teaches us that we are ultimately don't exist without divine energy. That without the energy, we'd cease to be. So if you think about E equals mc squared, it's a similar idea. Matter is energy. Matter is not just a product of energy, it is energy that's become shaped like matter. The best example, water. Water in a liquid form is water. You heat the water, it turns into gas. You freeze the water, it turns into ice. So if you put here a cube of ice, a cup of water, and a bottle of gas, show it to a child, he'll say, what is this? He'll say 3 different things. Anyone that knows it's the same thing. It's just 3 forms of the same thing, depending whether it was heated or it was frozen. So what do we know from this? That existence, as we know it, is really divine light. However, God imposed the Tzimtzum, so the light is concealed. We don't see it as light. We see ourselves. We don't see the light within the energy within existence. But everything is constantly being vivified and perpetually renewed through this energy. And again, it's our choice, our indeterministic choice, to see beneath the surface and realize that everything in life is just a surface husk, you can say, a shell. And it's our job is to look beneath the surface and reveal that light within. So light becomes a tremendous tool in understanding it exists, but it is dependent on something beyond us. And we have to understand that that's who we are. We exist, but we are dependent on the source. Now, there are many other lessons from light, obviously. I just gave one, but it's a fundamental one, and I also connected it to the other elements here. Now, with a limited time, obviously you can't do an exhaustive overview of all Kabbalistic, mystical, Kabbalistic, mystical, and physics parallels, but there are many, many more. I would have loved to go into the whole area of the unconscious, the whole discussion about what the superconscious of a human being is like. But I will tell you this, that if you go to my website, meaningfullife.com, you can find a lot more material on this topic, because I deal with this a lot. I'm very, very intrigued by the parallels. And above all, as I said, the psychological and practical applications. Because then everything takes on a whole different shape, because it really means something to our lives. You know, you could have a black hole in a marriage, for example. And you could have a black hole in relationships. And you could always realize, for example, if you've ever had to deal with the silence of your spouse, that can be like a black hole. It's much worse than a tantrum, because it really can kill you. But it's really more energy than the energy of talking because of its silence. I just found that to be an example. So you can apply it in so many different ways of life that can really enrich and enhance our lives. So with that, I would like to conclude by saying, as always, it's a great honor to say a few words to all of you and try to bring these different worlds together. At the end of the day, we are firm believers, and it's also logical that there is an inherent unity that connects us all. I feel my whole life blessed because I meet people from all walks of life, like yourselves, and I find that every time you meet somebody, you have the choice. Are you going to create a connection that unites us all and essentially defy the Tzimtzum that conceals our connection and create these cosmic connections? And when we create unity like that, it really enhances all of existence. Because think of it like musical notes in one large composition. So to me, that's the greatest joy and the greatest honor, to be able to connect with others. And I hope you feel the same. And that's for me why this Pesach program is so enriching every year, to find so many different people, diverse. I've been to many programs, and the reason I'm drawn to this one most is because of diversity. Bruce seems to have a knack for people of diverse backgrounds, where you don't come and feel claustrophobic. Everybody's the same way, everybody's dressed the same way, everybody has the same customs. It's really quite diverse, and I just love that. Because to me it comes down to the mission of it all, of creating harmony within diversity, which is the ultimate objective of, I believe, all mysticism and even all physics. To find the unifying forces, the unified field principle that will connect and unite everyone and everything. And that's up to us. And with that, I want to just say my final theory. They have not yet found the unified field theory, which connects all schools of thought: quantum mechanics, Einsteinian physics, Newtonian physics, and all the other different approaches. It's gotten down to four forces. They call it the gravitational, electromagnetic, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. But that one unified field theory has not been achieved. Here's my submission, my theory. And it goes like this. Part of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is that how does the indeterministic become deterministic? Due to the observer. That when you observe something, you actually change its reality. Again, very counterintuitive. Scientists always thought we were these objective observers. We watch something, we don't affect it, we don't impact it. And today, absolutely we do. For example, light can be perceived as a wave or a particle. And that's indeterministic. But when you measure it, the observer can actually impact it. So here's my theory. If indeed we are not just objective observers, and we impact the universe which we observe, which we interact with, So perhaps, unless we find internal harmony within ourselves, we'll never be able to find the unified field theory. Because the particles sense that we're at war with ourselves, that we're divisive, that we can't reconcile our own different voices. So as long as they sense that, how are you going to expect them to become unified? That's my theory. So in other words, we have to bridge psychology with physics, because until we find inner peace between ourselves, between you and yourself, between you and others, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and so on, we probably will not be able to find that unified field theory. What do you think about that theory? It's a theory. Think about it over lunch. It was a pleasure. Everyone be well. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.